So like I said, we're actually talking about story and theology. And I have to give a little thanks to Matt Gerolds. He and I have been talking quite a bit about story and metaphor and what story is, and he's written some really interesting, deep papers on this topic. Papers where you read a sentence and you say, what? And you read it again and then it makes a little more sense, those kind of papers. So Matt, one of the things that Matt pointed out was that first we have to think about metaphor. Louder? Okay. So what is metaphor? One of the examples that Matt gives in talking about metaphor is football is war. That's a metaphor, right? Because we don't really mean that there are explosions or that there are bullets or people dying, at least usually not people dying in football. And then on the other hand, there's also differences the other way, because football has 4 quarters, and it has cheerleaders, and it has things that aren't in war, right? And so it kind of goes both ways. It's a metaphor, meaning some things are the same, and some things really don't match. So why use metaphor? That's what I want you to think about for a little bit. Think about what football is war does in your mind. How is it different than just describing football as a sport? Does it do anything different than just a description?
Gives you a comparative picture.
Yeah, you get a comparative picture, and you get something that evokes lots of things, and you kind of explore maybe even in your own mind, how does this compare and how does it not? And people who've played football will tell you, well, there's this camaraderie. And people who've been in war will tell you there's camaraderie. I would do anything for my brothers. And there's this team, there's this physical combat, and this feeling that you've got to work hard to be ready. So moving on from metaphor to story, they're a little bit different too. But a story is a metaphor, but a bigger and more developed one. And think of 2 things. One is there's lots of points of comparison. Okay, so you could write a story, for instance, about a football team's season, and there may be a lot of things that end up getting compared to war, right? Maybe they'll say things like, "Let's fight," or "I've got your back," or the time comes in the movie when it's a big thing, and there's this like war march music that's pushing them on, you know. And then the second thing is that there's embellishments in a story that help you to feel what you ought to feel. Did that make sense? And that's not necessarily true if we just give an explanation of what it is that we're trying to teach. So let's just talk a little bit about story. What if I ask this question? Do you, as a reader or movie watcher, have a moral obligation to hope for or to root for the right side? So, for instance, is it sinful to hope that Sauron wins? And I'm not just talking so that the movie ends and you can go home because it's horrible, but because I feel that way. I'm not a big Lord of the Rings fan, but anyway. What do you think? Do you know who Sauron is? Yes. He's the big, yeah, okay. He's the big eye. Yes, he is the seat of evil in Middle Earth. Lord of the Rings.
No.
Not sinful. Okay? Why do you say no?
It's a story. It's fun.
Okay.
I can do what I want in my mind and have fun thinking about what the story would be like if Sauron did win.
Okay. Yes?
It's not sinful.
Not sinful.
No.
Okay. Why do you say not sinful?
Right and good are 2 different things.
Good. Okay. Anyone want to disagree? So we have two opinions that say not sinful. Anyone disagree?
Well, just to, I guess, to try and introduce what we are responsible for in our thoughts. You know, is our thought and emotional lives neutral? Are they fallen? And I guess maybe that's the question we should be answering first, is it possible for our thought and emotional lives to be neutral, morally and spiritually neutral? If so, then I think probably anything goes. But if not, then I think this question has more relevance.
Sure. Yeah, it's not a super easy question. Okay, good.
So in this statement, when you say the right side, do you mean the side that the author intends for you to be sympathetic with, or the correct moral side, like the side that reflects what in reality morality is? Because there are plenty of stories written from the viewpoint of who we might say the bad guy and make the bad guy sympathetic. And so, well, whereas like Lord of the Rings, like you have evil and they're portrayed as evil and horrible.
Yeah, they've got spikes and
And so it's like from the way the movie's written, you're supposed to not like those people, and in society at large, we're supposed to also not be on the side of evil. But what about the story where the villain is sympathetic, or maybe the main character, and you sort of like weirdly root for them? Is that what the question is more around?
Because they'll do that sometimes. They'll carry you along kind of emotionally in the film and get you to root for who, when you think about it later, you're like, well, that was actually not the good guy.
You have to define what right is. That's the catcher.
Yeah.
I mean, like he's saying, the author or the director is going to pull you in a different direction. And is that right, or is that, what is that?
Yeah, yeah.
I've seen movies where the hero is certainly not a virtuous individual and accomplishes the dispatching of the evil ones in the film in ways that are themselves not righteous. And I've had to ask myself at the end, having felt good that the bad guys are gone, going, yeah, but is that how God would want us to deal with that evil? And it's a check on my own attitudes about what I'm tolerating in my mind as ways to deal with evil in this world.
Yeah, and I think what we'll end up saying about things like that is that we all want certain things in our heart, and by all I mean all people, and they relate to our need for the gospel and for God. And sometimes a story can take a need and then supply a way of meeting the need that might not be good. But it kind of sneaks that into our thought processes.
We have emotional baggage with it, too. Our own person, we have our emotions that go along with what our background, what we went through, different things like that attach to what that.
Sure. So each person views it differently because of their own background.
Yeah.
Yep. Should we go? We're going to go on, but...
Okay, I just wanted to, I happened to be reading Romans 12 this week, and it has a verse in 9 that says, let love be without hypocrisy, abhor what is evil, cling to what is good. And I appreciate what Mike says, because it made me change what I thought originally. Because he's talking about creativity and imagination. What if? A what if scenario. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with a what if and imagining. But when it says to root for or to celebrate something that is wrong,
Yep.
or something that is at least portrayed as wrong, I question that.
All right, let's keep going. So this, actually we've already discussed this, so we don't have to, but the question is, how much should you play along with the author, this is kind of what Griffin was saying, by adopting the moral standards of the universe of the work? Okay, so I have to introduce this idea of universe in story. A universe is basically, okay, so this is a map that someone made. I'm not sure if
Wizard of Oz?
Frank, this is the map of Wizard of Oz. This is part of the Wizard of Oz universe, okay? And this is a map of Middle Earth. This is actually a little part of Middle Earth. But the universe of a story includes much more than just its geography. It also includes, like in Middle Earth, there's a god or gods. I think it's a council. I'm not real big on Lord of the Rings, so I'm sorry if I've said wrong about it. But it's also maybe morals about what's right and wrong in that universe. And to some extent, the author can make a different universe than this one. Our God is not in Middle Earth. It's a different God, and they think a little bit differently. So within that story, there's rights and wrongs. And so to some extent, you can't take your own and just pull them right in. But to some extent, you can't help it either. So okay, so here's the question. What if God, the God of the universe of the book, has decreed that it is sinful to kill certain animals? Is this
Narnia.
Narnia? Yeah. If it's a talking animal, it's sinful to kill that animal in Narnia. And does it make a difference if the universe of the book and our universe are purportedly the same? Right? So Star Wars or Lord of the Rings are different universes. Right? But Walk the Line is quasi-historical. Do you know what Walk the Line is? It's Johnny Cash, right? So it's about his life. He lives in our universe. So we got to think about whether those are the same. And I'm not really going to answer that question, but we're going to talk more about it, and I think you'll kind of come to an answer. All right, so let's talk about God's use of story, okay? Because God uses story a lot. So again, first we're going to talk about metaphor. God says that He's our Father and that we're His children. That's a metaphor. He's not exactly like a father that we know. You can't take everything about a human father and say, okay, that's what God is like. There's differences. But there's also intimacy and love and perpetual, ongoing care and protection and things like that that we do want to understand in that. So the metaphor is valuable. Jesus says that He is the vine. But we don't expect Him to have, fine bark and leaves when we see Him. And He says that He's a door. And He says that He's a shepherd. And He says that He's bread. Right? But those are metaphors. God says when He found us, let's see, how are we on time? Okay. God says when He found us we were spiritually dead. And we were spiritually blind. So what do those things mean? And people actually kind of struggle about spiritually dead. What does that mean, someone is spiritually dead? I think especially when you combine it with the fact that the same prior to regeneration person is called spiritually blind. Okay, listen, this is at the end of John 9. Jesus said, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." Some of the Pharisees near Him heard these things and said to Him, "Are we also blind?" Right? They're a little doubtful that they, should, in their bigness, should be called blind. Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say, 'We see,'" because they say, the Pharisees believe they can see, "your guilt remains." So the picture here is not just of the unregenerate person is not just blind, but they are blind and claiming they can see. What can a dead person claim that they can see? Right, so these are metaphors. They don't always work. There's certainly spiritual type of stuff that people who are unregenerate love and want to do. So they have spiritual activity. They just don't have the ability to be alive in the sense that they can do spiritual things for God. Does that make sense? So we have to understand when a metaphor comes up, we have to understand it for what it actually means. I actually had, okay, this is from Kevin's sermon on John 9 from 2005, but I think we're a little short on time to read it. It's basically what I summarized. Okay, so on to God's stories, parables, right? So in Luke 15:2, the Pharisees and the scribes are grumbling, as always, and they say, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." Does anyone know, without looking, how Jesus responds?
What man of you having 100 sheep loses one of them?
Right?
No, it tells the story about losing the sheep in the wilderness, finding the sheep.
Right, lost sheep. That's one response.
Lost coin.
Lost coin and lost sons. Okay, so Jesus uses metaphor and story to respond to these Pharisees. Why? Because the metaphors do something that he can't do just by teaching. The metaphors illuminate the situation, and they help everyone relate to it and feel it, right? So everyone hears that, and the coin is actually a lot of money to them. It's not like, oh, I lost a penny. Oh, I found it. I'm good. It's really a lot of money to them, and they would really celebrate its refinding. And a sheep, and a son. So different people will find echoes with different story. But there's also a really interesting thing that you can ask here. Why 3 stories? Well, one is because you'll get different people echoing different stories. Maybe someone has not really been a father, so the lost son one, they don't quite feel so much. But maybe the coin they feel more. The other thing you can ask is, what if he only told the coin story? Then people might look at the story and say, well, look, the coin had nothing to do with finding itself. That's monergism, right? The coin didn't find itself. The man found the coin. Okay? Or you could look at the prodigal son and you could say, well, the father just sat home and waited. So what salvation actually looks like is people turning to God of themselves, and the father didn't really call out to him specifically at that moment, you know. So people come in their own power. And I would just present to you that the coin is more probably like, well, anyway, I would present to you that neither one of those is the point of the story. Okay? And so what the differences of those stories does is it says, don't worry about how they're coming. That's not the point right now. The point is, if you're the Pharisee and you're watching people return to the faith, how should you feel? And you can look into your mind and use the resource of finding these things, which hopefully echoes with something you've found and rejoiced in. And you can say, oh, how do I feel so much happier about that than what I feel about these people coming to faith? And you can critique your own feelings. Does that make sense? So, this will become a little bit of a theme. Parables are often lessons in how we ought to feel. And I put an asterisk on feel because feel is not the best word. There are better words out there, but in terms of the words we use today, it's the closest one. Affections is probably a little bit better word, especially as it was used about 300 years ago. And so if you want to read that, you can read religious affections, which is about this whole topic. How we ought to feel and what sort of feelings are right. This is an interesting one. God also uses real life as parable. So, how many of you studied the story of Ruth and Boaz? If you haven't, you really should study it. Ruth is probably, I say my favorite book of the Bible, but maybe it's Romans, but I think it may be Ruth, because it is just a story of Christ and the church, but lived in these people. And so you have to ask, okay, well, this is a story in our Bible that we read, and we say that's like me and Jesus. But they actually really lived that story. So the question is, was it just a story like that God wrote, or did they really live it?
They really lived it.
They really lived
They
it.
had to, otherwise they wouldn't have had their great-grandson David, and that messes up everything.
Exactly. They're actually historical people who are in the line of Christ, yeah. But also God wrote it. So when you are the author of everything, when you're God, you can do stories like this, where it's real people, but their life is what you want it to be a picture of Christ in the church. It's pretty weird to try to think about that. So the next one is you are real, right? But one of the big purposes of your marriage is to be a metaphor of Christ and his church. Okay, so this is a metaphor, so I'm going to say that it has to do with your feelings. So why do we need a metaphor here? And I'm going to say it has to do with how you feel about Christ and how you feel about your marriage. So raise your hand if you've forgiven someone and then later realize, no, I'm still bitter at them and I need to forgive again. Okay? So think about that. It is hard to forgive, right? So in that moment, if you think about it, you can think deeper, more profoundly about your relationship with Christ. Because of how your relationship with your spouse or with whoever it is, if you're not married, then whoever you're trying to forgive because they said bad about you or whatever. So how does that work, right? So you're praying, Lord, it's hard to be a friend with this person, or it's really hard to be married to this guy. Help me to do right in this. And maybe, if you think about it, you'll realize that God might be thinking, you are no picnic. Right? Right? Because maybe you don't read your Bible like I tell you to. You don't pray to me like I tell you to. You only worship once a week when other people lead you at church. So I'm not saying God's a whiner. Okay? It sounds a little like that. But what I'm saying is God is emotional and he has right emotions. And we think of confess. We confess our sins and we are forgiven. We think that's really easy. He promises he's going to do it, so I confess and I'm forgiven. Bam. Right? And I think we have to remember our own difficulty in forgiving. When we forgive and then later we feel, oh, I'm still bitter about that, I haven't really forgiven. That forgiveness is not easy, despite what we think when we turn to God. And so God is on the positive side. So God says, you know, even though you're not easy to love, I chose you. And not once in the last 10 billion years have I thought about abandoning you. So can you take that and put it back in your marriage? Right? So when you feel, because you feel in your marriage the difficulty of forgiveness, you can feel that better in your relationship with God. Does that make sense? So, yeah.
Well, I find this one to be particularly interesting because it's actually a two-way street metaphor.
Yeah.
Like the understanding that our relationship with God is like our marriage both informs in some ways how we ought to feel emotionally about God and also how we ought to respond to our spouse.
Absolutely. Yep. Yep. So, and I think this is also an advantage of there's another advantage of movies here when it comes to feelings. What time are we done? 11:30? 11:30?
The bulletin has been saying 11:45.
Oh, wow, I got lots of time.
Keep on rolling. Wait.
Sometimes when, okay, so I'm going to just say all the things I have down to say and we'll see what happens time-wise. Sometimes when people think about the sovereignty and foreknowledge of God, they think, oh, then there's no surprises for God. So he's not really excited about anything, right? I mean, he says there's rejoicing in heaven when someone is saved, but he knew they were going to be saved forever. He knew that a long time ago, so it's not really a surprise. So you think of it like Christmas, and you saw the present in the closet, and then you don't want that to get out, so you act surprised, right, when the time comes. But you don't probably do it very well, because you knew that it was going to be Legos. Yeah, you can shake it. If it's Legos, you're right, you can probably. But, right, so when it's socks, then you're like, oh, well, I get the next one. So when we're thinking about God and emotions, and that He knows everything, so He knew when you were going to commit to Him and believe. Sometimes it feels like, well, if He really knew all that in advance, is it really still exciting for Him? And I think movies kind of inform that, because think about a movie that you have seen before, but you watch again. You still cheer, maybe you still cry. Knowing what's coming often doesn't matter. You get involved in the movie and you have the appropriate emotion at the appropriate time. And with God's, and so the point is that God's eternal choices and sovereignty and foreknowledge in no way stop Him from feeling the right thing at the right moment. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Well, it's like there's a difference between being surprised and being pleased.
Yes.
I mean, in fact, most of our experiences in life that we derive pleasure from are planned. Think of a family gathering at Thanksgiving or something. I mean, you plan for it a couple weeks ahead of time. That doesn't diminish the fact that you know it's coming, and in fact, the fact that you know everything on the table is going to be there and who's going to be there, doesn't change your enjoyment of it once it comes.
Sure. Yeah.
There's no surprise, but it's very pleasurable.
Yeah.
I think that's what God experiences there. He's not surprised, but He is still very pleased.
Yeah. So, are you seeing? Is this next? No. Whoops. If I can go back. So the question is: are you seeing that feelings are more important than you thought? Hopefully, you're seeing that. Psalm 47:5 says, "God has gone up with a shout, the Lord with the sound of a trumpet." God is celebrating our worship of Him, and He is emotional. We should be too. All right, so let's go to C.S. Lewis, because C.S. Lewis actually wrote a fair amount about stories and why we write stories and why they're neat. And so here's a quote from Lewis. He's writing this to a friend after the reviews came out for his book Out of the Silent Planet. Has anybody read the Space Trilogy from Lewis? It's interesting. It's not as fun as Narnia, but it's a really interesting book. So Lewis said, "You will be both grieved and amused to hear that out of about 60 reviews, only 2 showed any knowledge that my idea of the fall of the Bent One was anything but an invention of my own." So in other words, so the story takes place on other planets and basically looks at their view of the Earth. And there's peoples that God has put on other planets. Earth is the silent planet because after the fall, and after the fall of the Bent One, who's Satan, Earth became silent to the other planets, and it was closed off. That's just something happens in the book. So the fall of the Bent One is the fall of Satan, and subsequent fall of Adam. And it's not an invention of his. He's writing a space version based on Christianity. But listen to how he closes it. "Any amount of theology can now be smuggled into people's minds under the cover of romance without their knowing it." Okay, here's another quote from Lewis. It's long, so hopefully you can focus. It's hot. At least I feel hot. Hopefully you don't get too tired. Lewis said, "I wrote fairy tales," so he's talking about like Narnia, "because the fairy tales seemed to me to be the ideal form for the stuff I had to say. I thought I saw how stories of this kind could steal past or sneak past a certain inhibition which had paralyzed much of my own religion in childhood. Why did one feel it so hard to feel, why did one find it so hard to feel as one ought to about God or about the sufferings of Christ? I thought the chief reason was that one was told how one ought to feel. An obligation to feel can freeze feelings. And reverence itself did harm. The whole subject was associated with lowered voices, almost as though it were something medical. But supposing that by casting all these things, so all these Christian ideas, suppose that by casting them into an imaginary world, stripping them of their stained glass and Sunday school associations, one could make them for the first time appear in their real potency. Could not one thus steal past those watchful dragons? I thought I could. And I think Jesus thought so too. And that's why he uses parables to express how you ought to feel in situations. If you look at parables, a lot of times you can get part of the meaning of the parable just from looking at the situation in which he told it and what people are feeling wrong that leads to that parable. Okay, so let's do vocabulary. John?
I just want to make one comment. That last quote you had on the screen about how you could, with the use of a story, you could slip all kinds of
Smuggle theology in.
Smuggle theology in. I mean, I'm really excited about this, that you're doing this, and I think the double-edged nature of that sword is we have to be on guard of what other people are slipping into a story that erodes our theology.
Yeah. I mean, to the extent where you can think, if I don't like the right things, I might be a dupe. I might not like the right things because I have watched TV and movies, and I've just allowed myself to be duped by these likes and dislikes that these people have. Yeah. So vocabulary. Everyone's heard the word orthodoxy. It means straight teaching or right teaching. Did you know there's a word that means right actions?
Orthopraxy.
Orthopraxy, right? Someone say that? Did you know that there's a word that means right feelings? This was actually invented recently by Kevin Botter. I don't know, does anyone know who Kevin Botter is? He's the president of Central Seminary in Minneapolis. Anyway, he used the word orthopathy. So, right pathos, or right feelings. Okay, another long quote from Lewis. I think I'll skip it.
Do you have an asterisk by feelings? Is that, once again, the affections thing?
Yeah, because feelings is not a perfect word. Because it incorporates more than just what we think of as feelings.
I feel like going to the beach today.
Yeah.
It's not the same thing
Someone
you're asking
punches
for.
you, what is your response? Right? So another thing that C.S. Lewis said, which I don't have this in here, but Lewis said that good stories are training in right responses. Okay? So what he meant by that is that if the characters in the stories are in a situation and then they respond well, then you as a reader learn that response is an appropriate way to respond. Especially if good things happen, or if the good authorities in the book condone it later, And so, responses is about more than just feelings, right? I mean, it's about sometimes just gut reactions. Gut reactions would be part of feelings. Someone punches you, is your first reaction to punch them back? Because Jesus says it shouldn't be. But that's a response that may happen really quick. Anyway, here's another word, Schadenfreude. Okay, so who's over, let's say 40, knows what the word Schadenfreude means? John? Okay, raise your hand if you know what Schadenfreude means. Okay, pretty good. I thought we'd get more at this table. So, do you want to say?
Well, I'm a little nervous now. I think it means delighting in other people's misfortune.
Yes, exactly. It's taking joy from the calamity of others, or the harm or misfortune of others.
That's why the Three Stooges is so powerful.
Right. But also like fail videos, right? So do you know what fail videos are? Fail videos are pretty popular, and what they are basically is is people making bad choices on their skateboard or trampoline over the house or jumping on a cactus, you know, and then you make a video of it and they're pulling out these cactus things and people watch it and they laugh, right? I mean, I think that if you're over 40, you probably hear that and think, that's psychopathic. Why would anyone take joy in the harm of others? But if you're less than 20, right? You think it's funny. Fail videos are funny. America's Funniest Home Videos is sometimes like that. Yeah. But fail videos are painful. I mean, if you watch them, these people are being hurt. And it's not just embarrassing. Usually, Funniest Home Videos is more embarrassing, or you know, the dog runs in. You know, anyway. But even Gabe sees something, and his reaction is to kind of smile and go, "Ouch, that's gonna hurt," you know, like it's funny. And if you think about it, is that a right reaction? Okay, so I'm not judging that since you like it. I mean, I'm telling you like it. It's not that you choose to like it. Your culture likes it, and as a young person, and that's just
doesn't that get back to your first question, your original question?
It kind of does, except this is real life. Because fail videos are, there are faked ones though. There are ones where people fake it, and it looks like they got hurt. Okay, so let's talk about movies. Yep.
I would say it has to raise a question about how we think differently again, because you know, in the past, those things on fail videos used to be portrayed in movies, and then they weren't the real thing. I mean, they were a portrayal, and we used to laugh at them then.
Yeah.
Not because they really happened to the person, but because it was a dumb thing if it would happen to the person, and that's where we got the humor out of it. But no, that wouldn't really happen to somebody. They wouldn't really jump on a cactus. Now they really do it, and we still find it funny. What does that mean in our minds about that switch from portrayal to actual?
Yeah. Yeah.
That we're accepting that, you know.
So, okay, so movies that we'll watch. That's most of the philosophy of movies, although we'll do some more next week. We're going to have 2 weeks of introduction. So I'm going to list some movies, and I'm interested in kind of if you've seen it before and what you think. Griffin?
Is this going to be, like, I saw part of the list, and it seems like a lot of these are long movies. Are we going to, like, watch clips, or just kind of...
We're not going to watch them here. Your homework is going to be to watch these movies.
Okay.
So you're expected to watch them at home.
I was going to say, it's like, wow, that's going to be the whole...
I might put some clips from them here to talk about. But I'm going to want you to watch them, and I'm going to make kind of a handout that you can answer some questions in general about movies and help you to, because I want you to think about them. I want you to say things. I want you to see metaphor more in your life. Like even this morning, because it's on my mind all week preparing for this. Even this morning, we sang, when we were singing I'll Fly Away, we sang the one about no more cold iron shackles on my feet. I have never had cold iron shackles on my feet. Right? I mean, I haven't. I don't think. If I did, it was for a play or a game or something.
What kind of game does
Right, but I mean, my point is, if you sing that song and go by those lyrics and don't realize that what he's talking about when he writes that, or whoever wrote it, that we're longing for the days when we don't have these strong temptations for sin, and that we are not bound to sin, and again we realize how we hate that, and we long for heaven, partially because we'll be fixed, and we won't have these bondages. Okay, so Pride and Prejudice will be first. Starting off kind of light, well, not light in the sense, raise your hand if you've seen Pride and Prejudice. Okay, so that female table over there, raise your hand if you've seen it more than 20 times.
Wait.
Each week I'll try to talk a little bit about the upcoming movie and kind of give you some ideas to understand it a little bit better. Does anyone consider themselves a big fan of Pride and Prejudice? Does it worry you that I put it on this list because you think, you're going to say my favorite movie is bad? Do you think that? No? Okay.
I see an agenda here.
All right, the next one is Lego Movie. So we're kind of shooting the gamut there of
Sophistication.
settings.
It took a lot of work.
The Lego Movie actually doesn't come out on DVD for, what, Jen, a couple weeks?
2.5 weeks.
So you may, if it times out, you may have to see it in the theater. But I think I am actually going to be gone the week after we do Pride and Prejudice. So I think it'll be out on DVD by the time. So sign up for it now on Netflix if you have Netflix, so that you get it when it comes out. Then we're doing Life of Pi. Who's seen Life of Pi? Who's eager to see it again? It's a little painful, this one, but it will be a good talk. Okay, Les Miserables, you'll have to get back to me. You can send me emails. Big fan?
I've seen half of it.
Half of it. Okay.
I've seen 2 different versions.
Oh yeah, there's like 5 movie versions of this book. If you're a really good reader and fast, you could pick up the book and try to read it in the next 4 weeks or 5. It's like 1,300 pages, but it is an awesome book. It is a must-read. Get back to me because we can spend 2 weeks on it or we can spend 5 weeks on it. And you just kind of have to decide how much Les Miserables you want. Harry Potter?
All fun.
Which? The first one?
I don't know. I'll probably do the third one.
All of them.
All of them. This table says all of them. So anyone surprised that this one's on the list? No? Not surprised?
Because
Okay.
Kevin's professor.
And then a movie called Hugo. Has anyone seen Hugo?
I've heard of it.
About the boy in the...
I've
Yeah.
seen the first one.
About the boy in the train station. The first one, is there a sequel?
No,
There's only like, aren't there like 3 books of it?
You're thinking Juno.
No, there's only one book. There's one book, but most of it's pictures.
Oh yeah, there is a book for Hugo.
Yeah,
Actually,
it's
you're
the
right.
invention of Hugo Cabaret.
That's what the
Yeah.
movie's based on.
Yeah, it's a really interesting book because it's lots of pictures. It's
Graphic novel.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah. Time-wise, how are we doing? It is 11:20. Okay, I'll do. So we have I have some goals for this class, and I'll talk about one of them, and then maybe we'll be done. So why watch and talk about movies? The first one is to build our faith. What we're going to find is that seeing the need for God, which we're going to interpret in these, that is in all men, this means practically or basically, helps us to believe. Why is that? I think you can make the argument that our hunger for God is a clue that God exists. In general, all human desires have sources of satisfaction. So if you're hungry, there is a such thing as food, right? You might be hungry for a steak and you won't get a steak, but the point is that food exists in the world and correlates with your hunger. Sexual desire correlates with sex, thirst with water, tiredness with sleep. So things that are in our heart that we all need is a clue that something to satisfy them exists. And so this is not like an ironclad proof for the existence of God, obviously, but I think that the fact that everybody is desiring God is a clue that there is God. So how do movies do that?
Question.
Yeah.
Why did you decide to put the squiggle in there?
I don't know.
Okay.
It just felt funny when I wrote all men, and I did.
God, Jesus needed God too, even though he was God. But in the, I mean, we see how he, as a man, needed God. So I think it'd be safe to say all men.
I mean, many men deny their need for God, but it is still true that they do have a need for him.
Yeah, yeah, and they may satisfy that need in odd other ways.
Right.
Yeah. So in stories that they write, we will see again and again echoes of the gospel, echoes of God. Creation, fall, redemption, restoration. We'll also see ideas and basically underground assertions or substantial assertions that say things like, there is beauty. There is right and wrong. Everyone thinks there's right and wrong. You know? No one acts as though there are no morals. Even if they say there is no God. It's just humans and we'll be here for a while and then poof, we'll be gone. But they still believe there's right and wrong. They don't view genocide as kind of a bad idea that they wish people kind of didn't do. No, they think it's wrong. It's evil. So in everyone, there's this idea that morality exists. And that idea that morality exists is also an argument for God. Because in all of us, there's this sense that something's got to be right and wrong. And it actually has to be that way. Everyone knows it has to be that way. But then there's a little bit more closer to Christianity things like, I have guilt. I've done bad things, and what can I do about that? That's also an idea that exists in a lot of movies. And things like, I want heaven. I don't deserve it, and I can't attain it, but I want it. Which leads to, I need a hero. So these ideas exist in all of our hearts. So the question is, why are they there? Writers have them, readers have them. So when readers read stories that have these elements in them, they say, wow, that was a good story. Right? So then it becomes a popular story. So stories we like are stories that echo these things. Also, this idea matters in our evangelism. Because in a sense, you don't have to convince people that God and the gospel are real. I know that sounds weird, because that's kind of the point of evangelism, right? But if this idea is true that I'm saying, the fact that everyone likes a story that has these things shows that they already kind of know it. They already long for it, and they're already expending their life's effort to trying to fulfill it in some way. So the point then in evangelism becomes not telling them that they have a desire for the gospel, but telling them that there's a real satisfaction for it.